If I Trust You. London beyond capitalist realism. Looking at the photographs in this book, I'm reminded of a train journey into London a day or two after the 2015 election. I sit on the train, still in a state of shock, raw with defeat. Against all the odds, defying the polls, David Cameron's Conservative Party had won the election. It wasn't as if Labour had offered much of an alternative, but at least we hoped they might slow down the dismantling of the welfare state, defer, for a little longer, the onset of unmitigated corporate tyranny. But even those hopes, thin to the point of emaciation, were disappointed. On the train, I'm beginning to accept what this means. 5 more years of finance capital and food banks, desperately ill people forced back to work, committing suicide. 5 more years of even the most fortunate amongst us being condemned to fear and misery. More of the same, except the same is getting worse all the time. The Tories said they are thinking of the man chipping ice off his windscreen on a winter morning. They promise us that he will be able to do this forever, that winter will never end. Fear, misery, work, harder work, always more of it. We can't slack and let the Chinese beat us. Nothing leisurely, always on from now on. Save money by going online. You can't expect the nanny state to look after you. You have to look after yourself and your hard-working family. No one else will. And after all, that's better, isn't it? Socialism removes your dignity. You only get dignity from work. Any work is good, no matter how degrading and demanding, no matter how precarious and onerous. We must be grateful to the wealth creators because they give us jobs. We shouldn't necessarily expect to be paid as well. What do we think these wealth creators are, charities? How can they create wealth if they are also required to pay people a living wage? That's putting shackles on them. There's no way they'd compete with the Chinese under these conditions. Looking out of the window, I'm listening, for the first time in maybe a year or so, to Burial's Untrue, but it's like I'm hearing it properly for the first time. Archangel, Ghost Hardware. There's something strangely soothing about the way the music allows me to descend into my sadness. I can't take no more. I read an article online written by a woman with a disabled child. She says she managed to hold it together until the afternoon of the day after the election, then she collapsed in tears. Sitting on the train, I weep too, etched headplate playing in my headphones. There's an uncanny synchronicity between what I'm reading, how I'm feeling, and what I'm listening to. The lonely sampled voice singing, I can't take no more. As I weep, I realize that a smog of low expectations and quiet terror has dissipated. A grey haze of ambient depression has transformed into wrenching sorrow. It is overwhelming, not just the sadness, but the rush of feeling itself. Depression, after all, is not so much a feeling as an inability to feel. The train is at the point where Essex bleeds into the edges of London. Essex was the mythical heartland of Thatcherism, the fantasy zone projected by The Sun, the place where the inner city whites flew to in order to escape the GLC's cosmopolitan London, later the site of bizarre experiments with scripted reality TV, a working-class fast-track to celebrity, and celebrity is sold like salvation in the blandly grim high streets of England's clone towns. Essex was also the home of Russell Brand, its decline into pound shops and penury movingly evoked in The Emperor's New Clothes, the film brand made with Michael Winterbottom about Britain under capitalist realism. At the edge of Essex, the music feels super vivid now that I can really feel it, an emotional map of the city I'm moving towards. In the election, London had voted for Labour. We later learned that it was the English nationalists elsewhere in the country who swung it for the Tories. Cameron's lacklustre TV performances were still enough to trigger class deference and a fear that had been expertly stoked by the tabloids. Vote Red Ed and you will get the SNP. Burial connected with me so powerfully, so viscerally, on that train journey, because the music evoked an audio vision of what's beneath London's protective crust. London conceals its caring beneath a crabby shell. So it's come to this. Beyond the sentimental charity telethons, caring has to be done undercover, furtively, as if it's something to be ashamed of. It's the only way to survive in the city. Autistic thousand-yard stare, defensive headphone bubble, the closed-off bodies, the silences and the averted gazes tell of a city under immense, barely livable stress. You lock yourself into your own space, sending signals that you want to be left alone. But you're not alone, at least not in the old way. There is no enclave of solitude anymore, no space for drifting and daydreaming. You pause to look around the carriage and see that everyone is doing the same as you, clicking and pawing touchscreens, secreting vital energies into a hungry hive. You feel a disgust that is also a self-disgust, seeing yourself as a hooked animal pleasuring yourself in public. Then you go on clicking, too exhausted to do anything else, but never too exhausted for one more click. Weary and bored of internal exchanges like this, too, weary of these boring compulsions, but unable to give them up. And that is boring too. How can you be bored and addicted at the same time? You can't hold the thought long enough to answer the question, attention fraying off, dispersed and diverted by the commercial commands massing in your peripheral vision, restive, libidinal parasites that sap your energy even as you attempt to screen them out. The screening out also requires energy. There's a strange doubling of London and capitalist cyberspace. Dominant London is like capitalist cyberspace made into a physical environment, an environment that we can survive in only because of callousing, because we develop a protective shell, a hard-faced psychic avatar that quips and condemns rather than admitting any vulnerability. Vulnerability is a luxury that none, including the super rich, can afford. This is one effect of what we casually label neoliberalism, and it's now clear that neoliberalism is not so much a political ideology as a pervasive program which has devastated our capacity for intimacy as much as it has destroyed the provision of public goods. I see your light. It burns forever.
I saw your light now. It burns forever.
The music yearns for a city that has all but disappeared, a subterranean 90s London that the UK PLC heritage industry glosses over or ignores entirely in its cocaine rush to regurgitate Britpop, Hirst, lads' mags, superclubs. Yet, like the photographs in this book, Burial's music is also about a 21st century London. It's as if Burial coaxes the city's secret sadness out, making all those displaced R&B voices sing for London, springing them from their hard gloss context so that they float prawn pink, painfully exposed in the enveloping bass. The bass, warm and dark, provides a caring environment that is lacking in public London, where most caring is done behind closed doors. In Burial, the derelict architecture of rave is a strangely welcoming environment for all these R&B orphans. An environment as full of love as the city's streets and underground carriages are devoid of it. It's not that we don't care, it's that we can't care. Capital and the capital have sucked us dry. We cling on, automatically piloting through the days, not expecting much respite, damaged, diminished. I moved out of London a few years ago, for the same reason that so many leave the city. The expense of living there had become unsupportable, but also because I became conscious of how much energy that simply moving around London now requires. For so long, the city has been held hostage by capital, its rents and mortgages forced up into the stratosphere by speculators, its priorities imposed by corporations and the super wealthy, those who want the city to be nothing more than a stunning backdrop for their meetings and their promotional images. So the city increasingly feels like a film set and a building site, a space in which all but the extremely rich are unwelcome, except to add local colour for yet another of the city's simulations of itself. Tube stations closed indefinitely for improvements, buses wheezing and snarling in perpetual gridlock, train delays taken for granted, as infrastructure, fatally ailing after years of underinvestment, keeps breaking down. In the anxiety-dream topography of the city, even pavements are often obstructed, while construction work, capital, building more and more apartments destined to stand empty, accruing value for someone somewhere, pushes out into the street. On election night, by the time the full nature of the catastrophe had become clear, it was too late to sleep. Inevitably, I had turned to social media, predominantly a heartless world, but also, sometimes, and in some of its spaces, a haven in a heartless world. Disambivalence is part of what keeps us hooked. Who is still awake? The insomniac wounded. So many of us. By 3 a.m., a friend has already written a blog post. He says the signs were already there, everywhere. We just couldn't read them. We didn't want to believe what we knew was true. The songs always playing on the radio, in shops, on commercials, told their own story, if you listened to what was beyond the surface gloss. It's true. I think of the unconvincing cheer of Pharrell Williams, Happy, more a command than an expression of feeling. A 21st century hey-ho, it's off to work we go for workers who never clock off and who need to keep having their spirits lifted. Happy. To look is to labor. Happy, happy, happy. Don't switch off. Don't stop clicking. Away from the screen there is only the void. Happy, happy, happy. The overwrought desperation of Sam Smith's Stay With Me, practically a national anthem for a country that has resigned itself to subjugation, supplication, despondent passivity. Everything about Smith seems counterfeit and forced, except the desperation, the reality TV contestants' craving for success. I really want it. Smith wants to be a great singer. His audience want him to be a great singer, if only because they want something in their life that is not ersatz. The desperation tells another story, difficult to detect beneath the hashtag injunctions, the social media imperatives, the branding taglines, the blaring outrage, all the lies and simulation that are so much background noise now. Livable shit. You put up with it. You put up with it.
Livable shit. You put up with it. Livable shit. You put up with it.
So many casualties of the neoliberal environment. A year or so before I was sitting on that train heading into London, one of the subjects of the photographs in here, DJ Rashad, had died from a drug overdose. A few weeks later, I learned that another of the people whose photograph is included here, Benga, was suffering from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. He blamed the pressure of touring. Overwork is making us all sick. Depression and stress cause more days off work now than striking did in the 70s. Overwork is mandatory today, especially in London, the only way to stay on the treadmill. The high-finance work junkies doing 80-hour weeks, no weekends, handhelds always on, have enforced their dismal addiction on everyone in the city. This state of perpetual busyness is what capital requires. In its final decadent phase, capital is going to be nothing more than a work cult in which conspicuous effort displaces conspicuous consumption as the marker of social status. Such frenzied simulation may in some sense be good for capital, but it is fatal for cultural production. If you want a simple explanation for the cultural slowdown of recent years, the reason that the underground is on pause while the likes of Sam Smith are on endless replay, look no further than those crazily high property prices. Artists and musicians can only live in London on condition that they have no time for reflection or absorption, no time, that is, for the things that make art and culture valuable, and indeed possible, in the first place. In the second half of the 20th century, London was a hub of new cultural production because the city contained large enclaves outside busyness, enclaves made possible by squatting, housing and unemployment benefit, higher education, maintenance grants, art schools, illicit commerce, networks of the poor. Slowly but inexorably, neoliberalism has not only taken all this apart, it has made it seem impossible that it could ever have existed. The art school bohemia that gave working-class people access to the resources of high culture and generated wave after wave of combustible cultural forms has practically all gone. The unofficial economies that supported jungle in the 90s, and which had only the most tenuous relationship to the corporate music business, have withered now that recorded music is moving toward decommodification. Many artists might now look back to the days of commodity exploitation with a nostalgic eye. At least the commodity entailed a dialectical antagonism in that it acknowledged that labor was necessary, if only as something to be exploited. In its current demented form, capital fantasizes that it can do without labor altogether. This is what capitalist realism has transformed into, capital's fantasy of eternal self-generation. Meanwhile, the networks of solidarity and fellowship that previously allowed the poor to weather economic hardship have corroded under pressure from capitalist realist atomization. In London, we have all been lab rats in an unofficial experiment, the aim of which has been to discover how far can neoliberalization go, how far can capital subjugate a population before conditions become unbearable. The city has seemed to function for so long only because of the remarkable tenacity of its population. Livable shit. You put up with it. And yet, beneath dominant London, beyond the conquered city, in those few cramped common spaces that remain, in private dwellings used like bunkers for refuge from the desocializing catastrophe all around, in the clubs that feature in the photographs in this book, in the tiny spaces in educational institutions that remain free from corporate control, here, astonishingly, another city subsists, a city of fragmentary joy, of a fellowship that is all the more intense because of its fugitive and fleeting quality. If we can get through for just 1 minute, it will be a start. On Burial's Archangel, one of the sampled voices poses a plaintive half-question. If I trust you. Actually, this is less a question than a phantasmatic conjecture. Like most love songs, the sample stages a fantasy conversation with an other. What will happen if I trust you? Will exposing my vulnerability mean that I end up being more wounded than I already am? Might it be better to stay in my shell, calloused yet shielded? This is the risk that falling in love always entails. But the question that the city has been answering since the election, with the remarkable rise of Jeremy Corbyn, which itself is part of a movement of history that has passed through Greece, Spain, Scotland, Royave, takes this challenge to a collective level. What will happen if we begin to recover the capacity for trust and care that capitalist realism has choked off in the past 30 years? Capitalist realism, after all, is just this feeling that no one and nothing can be trusted, that nothing will last, that we must always prepare for the worst and expect others to betray us. The photographs here are part of those questions, that project. Almost like Godard's editing of 60s Paris and Alphaville, Georg Gatsas has conjured from the boring cyber-Gothic dystopia of neoliberal London an alluring futuristic city, lit like a beautifully prepared installation. The pockets of the future here are eerily depopulated, almost as if they belong to some dreamscape. Ever since it became an industrial megacity, London has dreamed of itself as a depopulated space. If the sinister spectre of surveillance, unavoidable in contemporary London, is never far away, even in these photographs, the predominant sense is of an oniric future city awaiting its citizens. The crowded images of subterranean clubland, which kept experiences of collectivity alive in a desocialized city, gave us a clue as to what that population might look like. The most seductive theorists of the future now talk about a world without work, or at least a world in which universal basic income has reduced drudgery to a minimum. Apple and Microsoft propaganda, by contrast, has projected a future of increasingly intense screen addiction in which we are stuck forever on the insomniac treadmill of the touchscreen. But what if that time were already over? What if the touchscreen was the last relic of a neo-Victorian subjectivity? What if the future lay instead in a rediscovery of the club's tactility? It's this immersive tactility, the feeling of music in your whole body coming up through your feet, bass as an environment, not just something you hear through headphones, that is lost when we access music through phones. It could be, couldn't it, though we can hardly dare believe it, that the long winter of capitalist realism is finally ending, and summer is coming. Mark Fisher, October 2015.